putting this much power in the hands of one person takes us so far away from what the framers wanted.
The presidents who had by far more power, FDR during the New Deal and Lincoln at the Civil War. And after those periods were over, there was no permanent, dictatorship. Our system returned to normal.
I have no faith in Washington, D.C. at all. It is run by money, power, and greed. Who is going to protect the people from that in your county? And the sheriff has that obligation.
Hey there, it's Julie, and this is Top of Mind, where we tackle tough topics with nuance and an open mind. We're out to become better citizens, kinder neighbors, and more effective advocates. In the United States of America, who is the highest authority? Is it the president, Congress, the Supreme Court? President Donald J. Trump is flexing the power of his office in ways that historians and legal experts all across the political spectrum agree is unusual. In the first 100 days of his second term, President Trump signed 142 executive orders. That's the most ever recorded by a president, and more than most issue the whole time they're in office. FDR held the previous record when he was combating the Great Depression during his first term, and he issued 99 executive orders in the first 100 days. President Trump's actions have also been blocked by a record number of nationwide injunctions by federal courts, which the president has called a grave threat to democracy.
I was elected on a historic mandate, but in recent months we've seen a handful of radical left judges effectively try to overrule the rightful powers of the president to stop the American people from getting the policies that they voted for in record numbers.
So President Trump took his concern to the U.S. Supreme Court, which told lower courts in July 2024 to knock it off, saying that only it, the highest court in the land, can impose a nationwide block on a president's executive order. But so far, the Supreme Court's conservative majority has largely opted to let President Trump carry out his plans while legal challenges play out in the courts, including mass deportations and major job and funding cuts across the government. Whether that worries you or not probably depends on how you feel about the current president and his policies. But within 4 years, someone else will hold that office and may wield the same power toward different priorities. So here is the question we're mulling today on Top of Mind. How is the balance of power supposed to work when one branch is aggressively pushing for more? We're going to tackle this in 3 parts. Chapter 1, who made the Supreme Court supreme? We'll speak with a constitutional scholar about the surprising history of the High Court's power to tell the other branches what to do, and how the current Supreme Court is playing its hand differently these days. Chapter 2, how strong is too strong? We'll hear from a conservative legal expert who worked in the George W. Bush administration and thinks America benefits when presidents push the limits of their power. And Chapter 3, the Constitution is king. We'll meet the founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs Movement, who calls for a very literal interpretation of America's founding document and says sheriffs can refuse to enforce any law they deem unconstitutional. The movement's popularity says a lot about how many Americans view authority. Chapter 1, who made the Supreme Court supreme? If you do a keyword search of the Constitution for the phrase balance of powers, you won't find it. But legal scholar Timothy Johnson from the University of Minnesota says it's clear from the records that
the framers were worried about going back to a system that was, for all intents and purposes, tyranny, where all the power was in the hands of one person. At the time, that would have been the King of England. And so by breaking up the new government into 3 branches, one that would pass laws.
That's Congress.
One that would enforce laws.
The president.
And that one would ostensibly, although they didn't say it, interpret those laws.
The Supreme Court.
Would hopefully keep power from getting into the hands of just one person or one branch of government.
And yet, when it came to describing the duties of the 3 branches in the Constitution, the framers gave the courts little love.
Article 3 is the shortest of the 3 articles. There are only around 200 words laying out the entirety of the federal judiciary. The real reason for that is that most of the framers were lawyers. So they sort of, to put it bluntly, said, we think everybody knows how courts work. Let's just let them go. And so early on, what that ended up meaning was Congress and the president and pretty much everybody else in the United States pretty well ignored the United States Supreme Court. Didn't have its own building until 1935. It met in the basement of the U.S. Senate, and the court heard very few cases in its first decade of existence.
And few of them were particularly high profile either, says Johnson, until the case that changed everything.
Marbury versus Madison.
It's the presidential election of 1800. Incumbent John Adams and his Federalist Party lose big to Thomas Jefferson.
The Anti-Federalists or the states' writers or the Jeffersonians, those names are all sort of interchangeable, if you will. They were coming into power. And so Adams said, what we're going to do is make sure that the Federalists continue to control the judiciary. We can keep Federalists in power because judges sit for life tenure. So all sorts of judgeships were created by Congress in this lame duck Congress with a lame duck president.
But there was a paperwork snafu. The outgoing Adams administration didn't get the official papers delivered to all of the new judges it appointed.
And one of those judges for a very low-level judicial position, just a federal justice of the peace, was John Marbury. It had been signed, it had been sealed, but not delivered. And so when Jefferson came into office, he and his Secretary of State said, we have this pile of judgeships, including Marbury's, that have not been delivered. We're just going to burn them, and they're not going to become judges. And Marbury was denied his judgeship.
So Marbury sues, and the case goes before the U.S. Supreme Court as Marbury versus Madison because James Madison is Thomas Jefferson's new Secretary of State. He's the one refusing to make Marbury a judge.
And it is heard by the most famous, infamous, or powerful, depending on how you want to describe him, Chief Justice and his court, John Marshall. And John Marshall was an avowed enemy of Thomas Jefferson for a number of reasons. They were actually, I think, fourth cousins and never liked each other personally, never liked each other politically. John Marshall was a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson was a states' writer. And Jefferson has sort of given veiled threats that if he loses this case, he's going to have John Marshall impeached. He's going to really do everything he can to wreak havoc with the judiciary. John Marshall, however, was a very clever politician. The way I describe him to my students is that he was very similar to Bill Clinton. Whether you liked Bill Clinton or not, whether you thought he had issues, once he walked into a room, everybody wanted to talk to him. Everybody wanted to shake his hand. He was sort of the person that everybody gravitated to. And just like Clinton, John Marshall was very politically savvy.
So Chief Justice John Marshall engineered a mixed ruling where, on the one hand, the Supreme Court said that Marbury was entitled to the judgeship. So that was a defeat for Jefferson. But the court also said it couldn't force Jefferson's administration to make Marbury a judge.
And so Jefferson had no complaint with the U.S. Supreme Court and didn't go after Marshall to impeach him or go after the Supreme Court to strip of its power. But here's where Marshall's cleverness came in. As you turn the page, Marshall says, but, ... From here on out, the U.S. Supreme Court has the power of judicial review, which means we have the power to determine whether acts of Congress or acts of the executive branch violate the Constitution. And the most famous phrase that comes out of Marbury versus Madison, which I tell my students is the only thing I ever want them to memorize is, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. It wanted to make it very clear that, look, you couldn't have Congress or the president have the powers that they have and determine whether or not laws that were passed or executive actions that were taken, whether or not they are constitutional. So what you need is this independent arbiter, and that independent objective arbiter ends up being the judiciary. And that's where the Supreme Court garnered the vast majority of its power, not from Article 3, although there's a little power there, but almost all of its power is tied back to Marshall's majority opinion in Marbury versus Madison.
And so what's different then as a result of that decision?
Yeah, what's different is that at that point, the U.S. Supreme Court starts to become relevant. And its full-scale relevancy doesn't really take effect until after John Marshall has died. It's around 1850, and then after the Civil War as well, where the U.S. Supreme Court really starts to invoke its power.
Some famously controversial cases from this time are the Dred Scott ruling upholding the constitutionality of slavery and Plessy versus Ferguson, which said racial segregation laws were illegal.
And then as we get towards the middle and end of the Industrial Revolution, the court is pushing its power to help economic growth in the United States. This was, of course, during the Great Depression, and the president was trying to institute his New Deal plan. And the court, all the way through early 1937, continued to strike down legislation that FDR was getting passed through the democratically controlled Congress.
And this, says Johnson, becomes a really important showdown between a president and the Supreme Court.
For instance, FDR wanted to control prices, wanted to control particular industries, wanted to spend lots of federal money putting people to work. And the court simply said each of those was simply unconstitutional.
The Supreme Court was striking down these laws 5-4 in every case, with the conservative justices lined up against FDR.
4 of them were known affectionately, or maybe not so, depending on your political ideology, as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And they were joined by Justice Owen Roberts, who was conservative enough that he continued to give those 4 his 5th vote.
And President Roosevelt was so ticked about it that he started threatening to basically make those 5 justices irrelevant.
So he wanted Congress to pass a piece of legislation that would, at its core, allow him to put 6 new justices on the court. The theory then was he was losing every case 5-4. He would then turn around with 15 justices, win every case 10-5.
But then Owen Roberts, the tiebreaker justice for the conservatives, switched sides
and started upholding New Deal legislation. FDR backed off and knew that he had a friendly court now and didn't need to pack it with folks who he thought would uphold his laws.
So the court stayed at 9 justices, where it still stands today. But the standoff revealed a weak point in the Supreme Court's power. Congress decides who sits on the court and how many justices it has. Congress can even impeach a justice, though that's only ever happened once, back in 1804. Plus, says Johnson,
Congress always has the ability to overturn a Supreme Court decision. If it's a constitutional decision, it would take an amendment to the Constitution to change. If it's a statutory decision, it just takes a simple majority in both houses and then the signature of the president to change that ruling or to overturn that rule. So, for instance, in current day, we know that women seeking abortion on demand is outlawed under the Dobbs decision, at least at the federal level. If the Democrats were to take over both houses of Congress and a Democrat were to win the presidency, they could simply pass a law that says there is now a federal right for women to obtain abortion on demand. And that has always been considered part of the checks and balances that the branches have on one another.
Now, the Supreme Court does, however, have one tool to try and force a president to obey its decisions, says Johnson.
The U.S. Supreme Court or a lower court could simply hold the president of the United States in contempt of court. They could do it through civil contempt, and that would be where they would levy fines against the president and or the administration until they would carry out the law or spend the money in the appropriate way. The other would be criminal contempt, and that would be where the president could actually be taken into custody and put into jail until he complied with the court order, whether from the U.S. Supreme Court or a lower court. That's very unlikely to happen.
Didn't the Supreme Court already say that a president, in carrying his or her duties out, cannot be charged with criminal acts?
Well, what they said in Trump versus the United States is exactly right, Julie. They can't be held liable for criminal acts if they are carrying out their duties.
So Trump versus the United States was a ruling in 2024 prompted by efforts to charge President Trump with crimes regarding his response to losing the 2020 election and his handling of government documents after he left office. The court's 6 conservative justices ruled that the president has broad immunity from prosecution when carrying out official duties.
They didn't say anything about contempt. And so the question is whether a court could still hold the president in contempt and whether the Supreme Court would then apply Trump versus the United States to contempt proceedings.
So to take a current example, President Trump has issued an executive order ending birthright citizenship for children of unauthorized immigrants and foreign visitors. We recently did a whole episode of Top of Mind about that. You should definitely check it out. Now, most legal scholars believe that the president's order violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And suppose that is how the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately rules as well. But President Trump says, no, I think the court is wrong, and I'm going to keep denying citizenship to those babies. Would the Supreme Court hold the president in contempt and try to fine or jail him? Or would the court say, okay, well, you are disobeying us, but you're doing it in your capacity as president, so we can't charge you with contempt? That is yet to be seen, says Johnson. But here's what we do know.
The court seems, since President Trump won the election and took the oath of office on January 20th, seems very willing to defer to him, at least a majority of the justices, in a way that it was not willing to defer to President Joe Biden, for instance, using his emergency powers to start wiping away federal student loan debt. And so it'll be interesting to see how the court acts when President Trump is still in office, and how the court would continue to act if a Democrat wins office in 2028. And the only thing we can say about that is the very trite time will tell. But it certainly seems as though the court is willing to defer to one particular president right now, and that's the president who's in office.
Is this a worrisome development? And if so, why?
You know, for me, as a scholar of United States government, as a fan of the way that our government has been created, what makes this such a great form of government is where you and I began, and that is the separation of powers, making sure that there is not too much power in any one of the branches of government, making sure that they check one another. And if you get too much power within one branch, and in particular, the one branch that only has one person, I really do, as a political scientist, fear for the state of democracy if this continues to be the path that we're on.
Why do you fear for the state of democracy? That sounds kind of dramatic.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I would argue that my words seem hyperbolic. When you put that much power in the hands of one person, and I will be very clear, I don't care who that person is or what party that person belongs to. That was not the theory on which our country was founded. It's the longest lasting democracy in the history of the world, one that has been incredibly successful, not only economically, but militarily and in so many ways. And putting all the power in the hands of one person just fundamentally changes the entire game.
Timothy Johnson is a professor of political science and law at the University of Minnesota. So I've realized while working on this episode that I've always thought about checks and balances in a pretty cooperative way, where each branch has its own job and stays in its own lane, make laws, enforce laws, interpret laws, and that is how the balance is maintained. And then I spoke with conservative legal scholar John Yoo and got a different vision.
I think that the founders expected the three branches to be continuously fighting and struggling for primacy over policy.
And Yoo says we should want a president and Congress who are always leaning into that fight. That's next on Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. I'm Julie Rose. Hey friends, I would like to take just a moment and introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's The Lisa Show. Lisa Valentine Clark is the host. She's a comedian, actress, believer, single mom. And the show delves into the multitude of challenges that shape our lives, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, social issues. Lisa and the Council of Moms will tackle it and do it with a lot of laughs along the way as we attempt to figure out this thing called life. So check out The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get podcasts. In our quest to understand who is the highest authority in the land, we've arrived at Chapter 2. How strong is too strong?
I think the founders would have been surprised by a common belief today that the Supreme Court has the final word on interpreting the Constitution, or that the other branches don't have a say in what any branch does, that they're not allowed to continue to struggle and fight using their own constitutional powers. And this was the view, I think, of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln and FDR. Many of our greatest leaders, I think, held this view.
John Yoo is a noted conservative legal scholar who clerked for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and was a key architect of the George W. Bush administration's legal justification for detaining and interrogating war on terror combatants at Guantanamo Bay. These days, Yu is a professor of law at UC Berkeley and a frequent commentator on Fox News. He's also
a distinguished fellow at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin.
Okay, so credentials out of the way. Let's dive into Yu's view on a strong executive. He's written a book about this. And while not an initial fan of President Trump, Yu sees the president's willingness to push the limits of his power as generally good for democracy.
You know, James Madison in the Federalist Papers talked about the branches constantly fighting, that was the best for the American people if they were constantly struggling with each other, that kind of check would make sure that when they actually agreed that the public interest really was being best served.
So how do you think it's supposed to work out then if there is a clear difference of opinion on the interpretation of the Constitution? So if the president were to do something that the Supreme Court found unconstitutional, who's right in that instance?
I think the founders thought that in the end they would fight and that the American people would render their verdict through elections. So to give you a real example of something you actually described was the fight over the constitutionality of whether to have a national bank, the precursor to our Federal Reserve. So the bill is introduced in the very first Congress. And Thomas Jefferson, famously, who's the Secretary of State at the time, famously thinks that a national bank is unconstitutional. Nevertheless, Alexander Hamilton won out because he, as Secretary of the Treasury, advised George Washington to sign the bill, and the Supreme Court then upheld it. So there you have a Congress, a president, and a Supreme Court all agreeing that it's constitutional. Then Andrew Jackson comes along. Andrew Jackson says, I think it's unconstitutional. I agree with Jefferson. And so when the bank comes up for reauthorization, he vetoes it. And he wrote this amazing veto message where he said, as an equal branch, I have the right to interpret the Constitution too. And I don't have to listen to the Supreme Court or Congress or even past presidents. And he said, just like the Supreme Court doesn't have to listen to me, and the Congress doesn't have to listen to me about what I think about the Constitution. And he said, nobody can force me to sign a bill that I think is unconstitutional, even though the other branches may have their own opinion. I'll give you another example. Abraham Lincoln, if you want to look at a president who most directly challenged this idea of judicial supremacy, it was Abraham Lincoln, who I think of as, along with Washington, our greatest president. Lincoln had a tough problem because his party, the Republican Party, was founded and rose to prominence on the idea that Dred Scott was wrong. You know, the Supreme Court saying that slavery is just an inherent part of the Constitution and could not be changed by Congress or the president. So Lincoln said, yes, I think the Supreme Court is an important tribunal. I will obey it in most circumstances, but I can't claim that I will follow its opinions in all circumstances because then we've handed over our democracy to just a few unelected judges who can get things wrong. So what Lincoln said, this is the farthest I think any president has ever gone. He said, I will obey the decision of Dred Scott in that I will hand Dred Scott, the slave, back to his master. But everything else in the opinion is just like Jackson said, it's the Supreme Court's opinion, and I don't have to agree with it. So I'm not going to follow it for any other cases like Dred Scott's. I'm not going to go out and find other slaves who've escaped or freed and return them to their masters unless the Supreme Court orders me one by one. So basically, Lincoln said, unless the courts want to issue 1 million decisions in 1 million cases, I will not myself agree to return freed slaves to slavery.
And John Yoo sees echoes of that same reasoning in the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision limiting the ability of lower courts to issue nationwide injunctions against presidential orders.
If you think about it, presidents, both Biden and Trump, complained that you had an individual judge who would take, say, an immigration challenge and say, not only am I going to, for example, allow the plaintiff in the case itself sitting before me in the courtroom to stay in the United States, but I'm ordering the federal government nationwide not to deport anyone else either. That is essentially Chief Justice Taney's view in Dred Scott. And I'm not saying Trump has any idea about Lincoln or Dred Scott or any of these issues, but President Trump, like President Biden before him, is saying, why can this one district judge dictate the policy of the entire government? I can still pursue my policies outside that decision in other courts in other parts of the country until the Supreme Court intervenes.
What do you think happens if we get to a place where the president says, Supreme Court's not my boss? I can disregard their interpretation of the Constitution.
So I basically think Lincoln was right, that the president has to obey the decision of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, for example, you cannot deport these aliens we have here in our court. And Trump turns around and deports them. Then I think that Trump has violated the Constitution. Now, Trump has said publicly he would never defy a judicial order. But if he does defy judicial order, and again, not necessarily agreeing with the opinion or the logic, but the bottom line outcome, then I think that's an impeachable offense. And that's how the system's supposed to work, is then I think Congress ought to impeach him and remove him.
It seems like impeachment is impossible, like to actually remove somebody from office.
One used to think that. But we've done it now 3 times in the last 30 years.
Well, but it hasn't actually led to conviction. It just leads to a slap on the hand.
Well, I think that if the Congress really thought the president was violating the Constitution, then they should remove him from office. If they don't, then you see a president who's so politically damaged from it that, all right, Clinton's second term was completely ruined by impeachment. He had he achieved nothing in his second term, although that might have been a good thing. I mean, the country seemed to do pretty well.
But then you have President Trump, who was impeached twice, and then he was reelected.
And that is the choice of the American people, though, isn't it? I mean, he was impeached. He was first impeached, which I think contributed to his failure to win reelection in 2020. And then he's impeached again for his participation in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. But that was all laid before the American people, and they rendered a verdict. And they chose to say this, despite what he did before, we still want him back in office. I mean, ultimately, it is a country based on popular sovereignty, and the people get to decide in the end. And I think that's what the founders thought would happen from this constant fighting between the branches, would be that the people would watch and they would decide. And they did in 2024.
Do you see President Trump as exercising the power of the executive in ways that are unusual, kind of paving new territory?
Well, I think that what he's done is he's trying to press very far the powers that Congress gave the executive. So when you read about, for example, President Trump trying to restrict the use of electrical vehicles, or you see President Biden trying to increase the use of electric vehicles, it's because Congress passed something called the Clean Air Act, which gave to the executive branch the power to issue regulations like law to make the air clean. I mean, that's the phrase in the statute, basically, is to make, to clean the air, the presidency shall have basically all power of legislation. So Congress gave away a lot of its powers to the president. I think that's what's made the presidency so powerful now in a way that the founders didn't really anticipate. So to give you 2 examples where I disagree with what President Trump has done, tariffs. The Constitution clearly says that Congress has the power over foreign commerce. But Congress also passed a law called IEEPA in the years of Watergate, which gives to the president the power it's incredible how broad it is, to regulate or block any transaction that crosses national borders. Now, what Congress said was, but you can only do it if there's a unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. Where I disagree with President Trump, where I think, in response to your question, he is pressing things farther than ever before, is he said that the trade deficit threatens our national security. I don't think that statute thinks of long-term problems, social or economic problems, as emergencies. I mean, we've had a trade deficit, I think I looked up, since 1974. I don't think that's suddenly a national emergency. Then the second example I'd raise is President Trump's declaration that there's an invasion of the southern border by Venezuelans. So he's invoked something called the Alien Enemies Act, which says if there is an invasion or a hostile incursion by a foreign government, then the United States can seize anyone who's a national of that country and kick them out. Makes total sense if you're at war. What I don't agree with is President Trump saying that illegal immigration constitutes an invasion. I think they had in mind another country with its armed forces invading us. Again, he's not claiming that he as president can just under the Constitution invoke these measures because of an invasion. He's always claiming, I'm doing it because Congress gave me the power. Where he's going where other presidents haven't is how loosely he's interpreting the grants from Congress. But the problem here is Congress. They should never have given the president these powers in the first place. I think the founders expected Congress to be more jealous of its constitutional powers and more of a hawk on the president than it has been.
So, John, it sounds to me like you think we are better off as a nation if the power of the courts is limited. So then when we think about the legislative and the executive branch, do you think the nation is better off with a stronger executive or a stronger legislative?
I think that the balance we have now is too heavily tilted when it comes to domestic policy. I think that if you were to show the framers, I think, what the president does today in foreign policy, they wouldn't be surprised. I think that they expected the president to reach the height of its powers when it was a question of foreign affairs or national security. Again, the Federalist Papers talk about this quite explicitly. That's why you want to have a single person in charge, because the executive is characterized by speed and strength and decision. Those are the phrases that Alexander Hamilton uses. Domestic policy is different. You don't need to act quickly in domestic policy. You can take your time and deliberate. And I think the thing that would really surprise the founders and has led to this imbalance is the administrative state. The idea of this large bureaucracy, which exercises a lot of the powers of the government domestically. I think they did not foresee that Congress would give away so much power to these agencies in domestic regulation that the president really does have enormous power now. But it wasn't because he seized it. It was because it was given to him. And this was really the invention of the progressives at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. Not progressives in the way we use the phrase today, but the progressives of the last turn of the century. And Teddy Roosevelt, Republican, and Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, were the leaders of this movement. They thought that policy decisions, again, like air pollution or COVID lockdowns, should be made by experts, that all these questions had a scientifically correct answer. And so what we should do is insulate the people who make those decisions, the experts, keep them apart from politics. I think that was a mistake, because I think a lot of these questions don't have purely scientific answers, that they involve trade-offs, value choices. I think the COVID lockdowns are a good example. The cost fell on some parts of the population and the benefits accrued to other parts of the population. I think when you have those kinds of choices, that's what we elect people to office to decide.
Are those agencies, do you include them under the executive branch? Or they're like this fourth body?
Well, this is one of the responses that has arisen to this is that presidents now are trying to, and I think this is constitutionally correct, I think that presidents are trying to exert more direct control over these agencies. This is bipartisan. President Obama and President Biden are doing the same things that President Bush and President Trump are doing. And the Roberts Court, the Supreme Court, has actually been upholding these actions generally. And personally, I think that when Congress sees the president taking more and more of these agencies over, they will say, why should we give away all this power to the president? They're happy to give it away to some scientific body. But once they see a president saying, I'm in charge of the scientific body, maybe Congress will say, we should make these decisions ourselves again.
In the meantime, though, doesn't all of that power accumulating to the president put democracy at risk, even set us up for the possibility of tyranny?
There's always a risk of it happening, I suppose, but it's never happened in our history. And I would even say the presidents we have today are not even the most powerful presidents we've had in our history. The presidents who had by far more power than our presidents today were FDR during the New Deal and Lincoln at the Civil War. And after those periods were over, there was no permanent, dictatorship. Our system returned to normal. So you could say, yes, it's always possible. You wouldn't even have to give the president all the power we're talking about. You could just say an executive who's at the head of an army it's always possible they could seize power. Maybe we've been fortunate. We haven't had one in 225 years who tried to do that. Even Lincoln and FDR at the height of their powers never considered becoming permanent. It's happened in Europe and South America. We've seen it in the world all around us, but it hasn't happened here. I'm not saying I have some kind of naive faith, but I think we also have had a system which makes it very, very hard. For example, how could a president stay in office for longer than 2 terms? Every officer of the government takes an oath to the Constitution. And the Constitution says at the end of the president's term, it even specifies the day, they're no longer president. And then whoever won the election becomes the president on the inauguration day. And all of those oaths to obey the chain of command switch to whoever that new person is. Say people are, I think this is just just alarmism, but people think, President Trump might stay for longer than 2 terms. On the last day of his term in 2029, he will no longer be the president, no matter what he says. The Constitution terminates his term. Every single member of the military and the federal government who continues to recognize him as president will be violating their oath to the Constitution. We've never had to worry about that. Millions of officers disobeying their oath to the Constitution. I don't think we're going to have to in 2029 either.
John Yoo, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Julie, it was a real pleasure.
John Yoo is a professor of law at UC Berkeley and a distinguished fellow at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. He worked in the George W. Bush administration and clerked for conservative Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Okay, one more perspective to prompt your thoughts. Suppose the highest authority in the land is not the president, Congress, or Supreme Court. It's your local sheriff.
The federal government cannot tell me or any other sheriff what to do. They're not my boss.
What the constitutional sheriffs movement tells us about how many Americans perceive authority. That's coming up next on Top of Mind. We are a BYU Radio podcast. I'm Julie Rose. If you wish you could more confidently navigate the conflict in your life, well, I'm right there with you. And I need to introduce you to a new podcast called Conflict Coach with Dr. Emily Taylor. It's from BYU Radio. I've actually been working with Dr. Emily behind the scenes to make this podcast. Every single episode features a real conflict from a real person, and Dr. Emily coaches them through the skills they need to get to a better outcome. I learned so much from every single episode. I can't wait for you to check it out. Conflict Coach with Dr. Emily Taylor is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere you listen. So now for the final installment of our exploration of supreme authority in the United States. Chapter 3, The Constitution is King. We've heard how the Supreme Court declared itself the final authority on interpreting the Constitution, and how presidents can disagree and even defy the court in limited ways. Congress has lots of power to overrule and impeach, but doesn't use that power as much as it could, or maybe the founders might have hoped. So then it's up to us, the voters, to put different people in office. But that can feel pretty futile when elections are under the influence of wealthy donors, special interest groups, and 2 political parties aggressively redistricting to their advantage. It's no wonder, then, that Richard Mack's ideas resonate with a lot of Americans right now.
I have no faith in Washington, D.C. at all. It is so corrupt. It is run by money, power, and greed. My question to you is, who is going to protect the people from that in your county? And the sheriff has that obligation.
Richard Mack is the founder of a group called the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, or CSPOA. Thousands of law enforcement officers have participated in his training seminars since 2012. And while most legal scholars would say Mack's view of sheriff supremacy is not legitimate, up to half of sheriffs in the U.S. agree that their authority supersedes the federal or state government in their county, and say they would refuse to enforce a law they believe to be unjust. Around the time I started working on this episode, Richard Mack happened to email me about another episode of Top of Mind that he'd heard. And as I was looking into this concept of constitutional sheriffs, it prompted all sorts of new questions for me about who we trust to wield power on our behalf and why. Sheriff would not have landed on the top of my list, but Mack thinks it's obvious.
He works for you. You pay his salary, and he promised you in God's name that he would uphold, defend, protect, and preserve the United States Constitution, which guarantees that your God-given rights are protected. This is what made America.
So Richard Mack really got thinking along these lines in 1993, when Congress passed the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act. One of the things it did was require background checks on people buying guns. The FBI was given a couple of years to make a database that gun dealers could use to do those background checks. But in the meantime, the Brady bill ordered local law enforcement agencies to do those checks.
They threatened to arrest us if we didn't comply.
And Richard Mack, who was just starting his second term as the elected sheriff of Graham County, Arizona, refused.
So I go and challenge it.
You didn't want to do the background checks because why?
It's gun control.
And no gun control is acceptable in your mind?
Well, I don't know, read the Second Amendment and then follow and obey the Second Amendment. I tell that to anybody. Government only has one role in the Second Amendment, to guarantee it, to guarantee my right to keep and bear arms. Instead, they do just the opposite.
The NRA jumped in to support Mack and a couple of other sheriffs, and their cases ended up before the U.S. Supreme Court under the name Prince versus United States. And the sheriffs won 5-4. Conservative Justice Antonin Scalia wrote the majority opinion that no, the federal government could not compel a local law enforcement official to do federal tasks like background checks on gun buyers. Legal scholars generally consider the Prince ruling one of several that limit the federal government's ability to commandeer state and local resources. But Richard Mack reads it as an absolute repudiation of federal authority over sheriffs.
I'm not a federal agent. You know, if they want to come and contract with me, because I had a contract with the Federal Bureau of Prisons when I was sheriff. We kept some of their inmates. But they can't come in and tell me what to do.
Take current immigration enforcement efforts by the Trump administration, says Mack.
We have sheriffs now doing it on both sides, and they're both correct.
Meaning enforcing
refusing
it.
to help with deportation. We have them that have refused, and we've had them that have volunteered.
And you think that's correct?
It is correct.
Both.
It is.
But here is where the constitutional piece really comes in. While Mack says sheriffs are free to ignore any federal law they consider unjust, if there's a law that infringes on freedoms enshrined in the Constitution, they must resist.
We really focus on protecting the God-given rights of all Americans. So I started it in Graham County as sheriff. We put rights above traffic tickets. And I told my deputies, if you write a ticket, you better be able to document that there is a public safety concern, not just sitting there bringing in money. And I didn't want to be a revenue collector. I wanted to be a public servant, and that's what I wanted my deputies to be.
Beyond traffic enforcement, what was different about the way you were either enforcing or not enforcing laws as a sheriff?
DUI checkpoints. Everybody who knows and understands the Constitution should say, how is it that the Fourth Amendment says you must have probable cause before you can take action? And
so you stopped doing checkpoints to check for drunk driving?
No, we changed it differently.
Okay.
First of all, DUI checkpoints where they stop everybody is clearly unconstitutional. And there's a couple of states that have made it illegal. You can still have them. They must be voluntary. Put up a sign saying your participation in this checkpoint is voluntary. Do you know people still go through? Everybody, almost everybody does.
Still stops.
Still goes through.
Yeah, I mean, you see police sitting there. And
well, if you turn around, people are afraid that, that's a sign, I'm drunk. Can the police lawfully stop you just for turning around? No, that's not probable cause. Now, can the cop follow him and get a driving pattern? Yes. And then you can stop that person. But we have to follow the Constitution. We don't need to cut the corners in order to go after criminals. That makes us criminal. We follow the law, we uphold and defend the Constitution, and we protect civil rights.
So the common threads in positions constitutional sheriffs often take are personal freedoms, property rights, and a general mistrust of government. Mack, for example, was a key supporter of Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy's 2014 armed standoff with law enforcement over Bundy's refusal to pay fees to graze his cattle on public land managed by the federal government. During the pandemic, Mack's group, the CSPOA, opposed government-ordered closures and mask requirements.
We saw a sheriff in Arizona stand up against a Republican governor, and he was Republican sheriff, said, I'm not enforcing these unconstitutional COVID-19 mandates. I'm not shutting people down. I'm not arresting people for not wearing a mask. God bless Sheriff Mark Lamb for doing that.
Mark Lamb of Pinal County, Arizona, was America's most high-profile constitutional sheriff until leaving office in 2024. Before him, there was Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio, whose refusal to stop racially profiling people suspected of being in the country illegally earned him a contempt of court conviction, which President Trump quickly pardoned in 2017. The most prominent constitutional sheriff currently in office is Dar Leaf of Barry County, Michigan, who drew national criticism and praise for his efforts to investigate the 2020 election outcome.
Isn't it okay to verify our elections? People have been attacked and arrested for that. If somebody goes to him and says there was a crime committed in these elections, he has an obligation to investigate that.
You are encouraging other sheriffs to embrace the view. Through the CSPOA, you do trainings where you encourage sheriffs to
protect people's rights.
Okay. How is that not, though? How does that not become them imposing their own understanding of the Constitution on the people within their jurisdiction?
What would you rather have him do? Violate the Constitution, violate his oath of office, take private property away from citizens, which is clearly unlawful, and he's just supposed to follow let's just program
I think
robots.
I would rather.
We have AI now. Let's program the robots. We don't want sheriffs that can look at a situation and make his determination. Come on, you don't want robots out there.
I think that there's an argument to be made for sheriffs enforcing the laws as they have been passed by state lawmakers or by Congress or interpreted by the Supreme
legislatures
Court.
Who get paid by who? Big pharma and rich people.
They're voted into office just like a sheriff is voted into office.
They are? And how do they get there? They get there by lying, and they get the money from all these rich people.
Who holds a corrupt sheriff accountable?
The people do. You do. Go to him and say, why did you do this? Have a relationship with him. Challenge him what he does.
So this is key to the constitutional sheriff's concept. Even though voter turnout is often low in sheriff's elections and many candidates run uncontested, it's the fact that they are elected, whereas police chiefs are typically appointed by city officials, that qualifies sheriffs as the top defenders of the Constitution within their counties, says Mack. And he pretty much rejects the notion that the Constitution is subject to interpretation.
Freedom of speech, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to complain about government. And right in the first one, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I don't need 9 people in the Supreme Court or anyone else to interpret that for me. I don't need anyone to interpret for me shall not be infringed. I don't need anybody. Now, in the 8th Amendment, it says excessive fines or bail. Now, that might need a little interpretation of what is excessive, but I know what excessive is. Look at the traffic citations across this country. That is excessive. We write $9 billion worth of traffic tickets every year, and it's just an astonishing cruelty towards the people.
Somebody would disagree with you about that. I mean, each of these things,
some cops
it's all up for debate and disagreement.
Not all of it. There's some gray areas. I admit there's some gray, but they're very few and far between. I don't need anybody to tell me what the 10th Amendment says. I sued the federal government on the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is very clear. The powers not delegated to the United States government belong to the states or to the people. Do you need that to be interpreted?
His is a strictly literal take on the Constitution that goes beyond even the originalism embraced by the current Supreme Court's conservative majority. Originalists aim to interpret the text of the Constitution according to how it would have been understood when it was adopted. Even the father of modern originalism, Justice Antonin Scalia, acknowledged room for interpretation of the Constitution's text to allow, for example, some limits on the right to bear arms. But to Richard Mack, who is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Constitution is not merely a political text.
It was inspired by God. The founder said they were inspired. And so it was the foundation of America. If you destroy the foundation, what happens to the rest of the edifice? It falls.
Why do you think God inspired the founding fathers to grant widespread, unfettered access to guns?
Because of our right to rebel against our own government. When government is out of control, the last say is the people Declaration of Independence, I quote you a bunch from it there. But what the Founding Fathers' intent was to make sure that the people always have the final say, not government, that the people always have the final say. And if we have to do another revolution like we did in 1776, we will always have the capability of doing so and not bowing down to those who have disarmed us.
Do you worry that this view that you promote could encourage individuals to take matters into their own hands in the form of militias, in fact, I know that you are no longer, but at one point you were a board member of the Oath Keepers, which is an anti-government militia.
They were never a militia, and they're not a militia. And when they started talking about being a militia, I quit. So
the concern here is that the talk that you have, all government is corrupt, the federal government can't tell me what to do, corrupt state lawmakers can't tell me what to do, we can't trust any of these people. I could see where someone could hear that and say, yeah, and I'm going to take my guns and I'm going to go storm the Capitol. I'm going to go to assassinate an elected leader who think is corrupt.
It's never happened.
There was absolutely...
Not according to anything I've done or said.
Oh, you don't feel like you've ever promoted...
I've never promoted it, and anybody that comes to our meetings know that everything I say is based on a peaceful and effective solution. We never advocated violence. I've said this over and over because people have said, when are we going to have another revolution? And I said, do not ask me that question because we have so much work to do in peaceful and effective manners, and that's what we should be focusing on. Do not talk to me about committing acts of violence, and do not talk to me if anyone ever wanted to start what you just said, militia groups start and go and get violent. They would have to do what the Founding Fathers said. Write the Declaration and declare war against your own government. Is that ever a possibility again? I pray that it's not. And I pray that we can have peaceful and effective solutions against corrupt politicians, that they'll understand that the best way is the American way and adhere to the Constitution. I've seen too many innocent people put in prison. You're worried about that. From a sheriff enforcing the Constitution, defending the Constitution. Just the opposite. I've seen these bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. put so many different people, innocent people in prison. The IRS has made a living doing it. We need to be concerned about those types of violations, stop it, and get back to our Constitution. The solution's behind us.
Thank you very much for your time, Sheriff Mack.
Julie Rose, I appreciate being with you.
Richard Mack is former sheriff of Graham County, Arizona, and founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. As you can imagine, Mack has many detractors who consider his ideas more likely to promote chaos or violence than peace and equality. But I can see how, if you're troubled by government overreach and you trust your local sheriff to have your best interests in mind, you would prefer his authority over someone in Washington or your state capital. And trust is really what it comes down to, I think. Public polling shows Democrats are most concerned today about the president being too powerful. During the Biden and Obama presidencies, though, Republicans were the more worried bunch. The same partisan pattern has long played out in public support for the Supreme Court as well. So are we really a nation committed to checks and balances if we only complain when our own team loses the upper hand? What would it take to set our personal interests and partisan preferences aside in favor of robust power sharing between the branches of government? I would love to hear your thoughts. What questions are you still left with? What did you hear today that challenged you? Send an email to topofmind@byu.edu or reach out on social media to continue the conversation. And make sure to subscribe to Top of Mind on your podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And if you wouldn't mind leaving us a good review, that'll help other people find the show. And we love to see what listeners think about Top of Mind. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by me with help from Isabella Sosa, Samuel Benson, and Sam Payne. Our audio engineers are Hayden Thompson and Lauren Sandberg. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.